John, a very gracious concession speech by Governor Romney, call for the country to say we can't risk partisan bickering, put people before politics. Also a big push for his running mate, who you see there on the stage with him, Paul Ryan. He says, besides my wife, Ann, Paul is the best choice I've ever made.
Yeah. A short concession speech. I mean, it did sound almost like he hadn't written one before this evening. That he had written only one speech, as he told reporters, and that was a victory speech. There were two sentences about let's put the partisan bickering behind us. One which you quoted, which was to put the people before politics, and praying for the president. It's also interesting, there was a little bit of an echo of Senator Ted Kennedy, when he says our principles live on. It sounded like, the dream lives on speech of Senator Kennedy.
Let's go to Washington, where Jerry Seib is standing by. Jerry, you just listened to that concession speech. You've listened to a lot of concession speeches over the years. What do you make of it?
It just sounded to me like a Mitt Romney who didn't think he was going to be having to make a concession speech tonight, and in fact, the word coming out of the Romney camp all night long had been, that he only prepared one speech, which was a victory speech. So,
is that because he's a congenital optimist, or is that because somebody was doing some faulty analysis inside the campaign?
Well, look, I think there's probably somewhat superstitious. If you're preparing a concession speech, it means you might think you need a concession speech, and no candidate wants to admit that to himself or herself on election day. Particularly in this case, where I do think the Romney people actually thought they were going to win. They saw a path to victory. They thought they had momentum. No, the poll numbers didn't tell them they were going to get there, or that they were there yet on the eve of Election Day. But they really thought the independents and the undecided voters were all going to break their way, and that was going to be decisive. I don't think that was just spin. I think they believed it.
Jerry, Mitt Romney can now go off to one of his houses and enjoy a long vacation. But Paul Ryan has to go back to Washington and dive into this very contentious fiscal argument. How's that going to play out?
It's a really good question, Alan. I'm not sure I know. His place at the Republican table, has become bigger. It's moved toward the head of the table. There is going to be a real question now about who's got the dominant voice for the House Republicans when they sit down with Democrats and with the president and try to figure out what they do about the fiscal cliff. What is the compromise that's possible on spending cuts and tax increases? And who's got the biggest say? Is it John Boehner? Is it the Republican leader, the number 2 Republican, Eric Cantor? Or is it now Paul Ryan, who's the guy who just ran a national campaign based on a budget plan that he authored? And I think that's really going to be an interesting dynamic. And by the way, what are the political stakes for Paul Ryan? He has said all along, I'm willing to do a deal. That was a point he had to make over and over again as a vice presidential candidate. Well, now people are going to say, okay, are you ready to do the deal, not just stick with your plan? I think it's a very important position and also a very dicey one for Paul Ryan now. But he's a force to be reckoned with in a way that, oddly, Mitt Romney is not going to be any longer.
And Jerry, what do you make of Governor Romney's call on to put people before politics and to put partisan bickering aside? That's become a standard part of the stump speech in the last few weeks, but do you think that call from the stage at this moment will have any effect on how things play out in Washington over the next few months?
Bluntly, not particularly. That's the sort of thing you hear from winners and losers every night, on election night every 4 years. You'll hear the same thing in a few minutes from President Obama, undoubtedly. And it may be right. It may be that, but if it's right, it's going to be because people's political calculations have changed, not because they heard something emotional tonight. It's going to be because Republicans and Democrats think that they've run out of hall passes from voters to keep kicking the can down the road, to use the phrase, or to simply make arguments more important or more valuable in the political calculus than compromise. It may be that everybody realizes now that there's no gain in further gridlock for anybody, leaving aside the financial market voice, which is going to be very loud. And one of the interesting things we've been writing about, Alan, in the last few weeks is that the business community has stepped forward now. It has moved forward and said essentially, look, we're not going to sit on the sidelines this time. We want to get this deficit issue under control. We want certainty, and we're going to be a force to try to make that happen.
Yeah. So, Jerry, in some ways this election has played out as expected. The narrow loss for Mitt Romney in Ohio, for instance, is what you would have guessed from the polls we've seen in the last few weeks.
Right.
But in some ways there have been some surprises. You look at the loss in Virginia. You look at the hard-fought race in Florida, which I think we still don't know the outcome to.
Right.
There's certainly not just the Romney campaign, but most analysts expected Governor Romney to do better in those states.
Yeah, absolutely. The surprising thing tonight, last time we talked, Alan, you asked what surprised me, and I mentioned that Florida wasn't going Mitt Romney's way. It's actually, I think, broader than that. It's that in case after case in these close states, they all basically seem to have fallen to the Obama side. And you would have thought that there would have been a split among those. I actually thought going in that many of those were going to fall to Mitt Romney, not enough to get him over the hump because I didn't think he'd win Ohio, but I thought there was enough momentum in some of those that something would happen on Election Day to put him over the top. Well, something didn't happen in any of those states, really, to put him over the top. The only one of those he really held on to was North Carolina, which most people had conceded to him weeks, if not months ago.
Yeah.
So I'm a little surprised there wasn't more of a Romney wave at the end.
Jerry, talk to us a little bit about the Senate. It's a slightly different complexion now, some new players. Does the dynamic in the Senate change the debate over the deficit?
I think the dynamic in the Senate looks on the surface as if it's utterly unchanged. It was a total status quo election. I think it might change a little bit in the sense that Republicans really have to be back on their heels now. They really are going to have to ask themselves some difficult questions. Let's step back and look at this. There were 23 Democratic seats that had to be defended this year and only 10 Republican seats. In a year in this kind of economic environment in which the incumbent party was really the Democratic Party, the Republicans thought they had a wide open field to take control of the Senate. They didn't do it. They're going to have to step back now and ask themselves, why didn't that happen? And I think one thing it might do is it might embolden some Republican senators to go strike out on their own, to go look for the way to do a deal with some Democrats across the aisle, not to listen to the leadership so much, and not to be pulled around by the Tea Party so much, because the Tea Party probably now in two successive elections has cost Republicans control of the Senate by pushing to the forefront their candidates who turned out to be frankly terrible general election candidates. And Republicans have to ask themselves, are we going to listen to that part of the party anymore, or are senators now going to set out and do their own thing their own way, which is what senators traditionally do anyway?
Jerry, we've all been so focused on these swing states, but what is the national vote going to look like when all the votes are counted? What kind of a margin are we going to see for President Obama?
It's going to be close, and you're going to see a small margin, and that's going to be one of the factors that I think when we all wake up tomorrow and some of this dust is settled, people will look at that and say, well, this wasn't much of an Obama victory. It looks good in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote, it wasn't much. And that will go to the question of what mandate does he really have? How much control does he really have over the country? How much do Republicans really have to step back and basically acknowledge that he's won a convincing second term? They won't say it was a convincing victory. They'll say it was a narrow victory.
Yeah.
So I think that creates an atmosphere in which it's harder to claim a mandate if you're Barack Obama. And frankly, I don't think the president campaigned in a way that there was a really clear agenda for a second term that he could point to and say, there's my mandate for the second term. It was not that kind of election.
Yeah. What are you looking to hear from the president in this speech he's about to give?
Well, I think what everybody's going to want to know is, what's the outreach to Republicans? How does he frame that? How specific is it? Does he say, let's have a meeting at the White House tomorrow. I'm going to invite people down, or Friday, or whatever it is. People I think are going to want to know, okay, platitudes on election night always tell you that people the winning candidate wants the country to come together. I think the interesting question is there going to be something specific behind those words this time? And I suspect if the president's smart, this would be a good time to say that, because that's really, I think, what people want to hear.
Yeah, start right now. All right, well, you can see the crowd getting increasingly excited. I think we're expecting the president to appear any minute. Before he does, John, any other thoughts that you want to?
Well, I remember the one of the first times that he got the opposition into the White House, they got into an argument and he had to admonish them, I won. And I'm thinking that maybe he's learned. Maybe,
I wouldn't do that this time. Yeah. I remember having this conversation with Senator Bob Dole from Jerry Seib's home state of Kansas after he lost the presidency. Lost it badly, by the way. But he said if he had been elected, what he would have done was called the leadership of both parties down to the White House on the first day and said, we're coming here every morning until we figure this out.
We're going to have a beer summit, in the afternoons.
Whatever
on Friday.
it takes. Because this is the number one problem the nation faces.
Right.
It is a problem of dysfunction of government. We have to figure out how to work together. And until we can do that, we can't do anything else.
Yeah, that's right. And in his own self-interest, he wants to be seen, perceived as a leader. Well, to do that, you've got to lead. And that would be in that direction.